Welcome everyone to the session, the increasing importance of identity security in the era of the mega breach in Gen AI. The identity and IAM are concepts that are, I think, 60 years old now. They were introduced 60 years ago, about the time I was. And they're more important now than ever. I am honored to have joining me John Lennon, who is Director of Security at Okta, and he runs the Okta on Okta program, which he'll tell you more about. John, would you please take a minute or two and introduce yourself?
Oh, most certainly, because I love talking about myself. I'm John Lettinen, Senior Director of Okta and Okta at Okta, but for LinkedIn purposes, I call myself an Identity Security Director for the Okta and Okta program because that is ultimately what we do. We implement and offer identity services to Okta as a business, and that jives with my experience. I spent about 20 years in various large globally dispersed organizations, Apollo Education Group, General Electric, Thomson Reuters, and now for the last 3 years, Okta, because we are the practitioners within Okta. We try to offer and make our services as delightful to consume and secure Okta the business. But since they offer identity software, well, now we get to really do some fun stuff, which is try to position ourselves as the best and first customer of Okta's platforms, file off the rough edges, and make our platform better for our paying customers. And of course, last but not least, is sharing those stories, making ourselves available to prospects, customers, the broader identity community, generally speaking. And there we go. It's a very fun and unique role. And I don't know where I'm going to go after this because I don't think I'll ever find something quite like that again.
I'm sure I hope she'll never go anywhere. It's wonderful to have you on the program, and it's great to have, we've drawn all that experience. I'm John Gunn. I'm the CEO of Token and call myself the chief evangelist for next generation MFA. Clearly, in our eyes, there's a lapse there with legacy MFA technology and contributes to a lot of the breaches. I've got about 20 years in the cybersecurity industry, and it is the most fascinating industry to be in. When young people ask me about what do you think I do, like get into cybersecurity, it is so dynamic, it is so fast-paced, so changing. Most of my 20 years have been in the identity space, and I work with a few other providers and loved every minute of it. I think we'll jump in right now. We've got about 5 topics that we think will be of high interest to our audience. And the first one is, I'm going to ask you, John, do you think there's a real increase in data breaches and ransomware attacks? Because I mean, it's in the headlines every day, but there's also conflicting information. Seems like every week some vendor's putting out a new report. Ransomware is up 80%, it's up 20%, it's up 200%, it's down 15%. What the hell is it? Which one is it? But it certainly garners a lot of headlines. What are your thoughts on that? Is it real or is it hype?
So I'd be curious where the marketing initiative is to try to steer the media narrative towards, oh no, there's more breaches all day, every day. I think the much more practical and pragmatic answer is yes, they are ramping up. As the world becomes increasingly digitized. And in fact, the fact that I said increasingly digitized almost sounds like something that should have been said 20 years ago. Like it is taken, prima facie that this is now the plane for commerce, user, not user, I guess that's the wrong term to use in the context of the everyday person, but people need now to understand how their information is distributed on the internet. And as more and more of us become centralized in that context, well, naturally, we're going to be very juicy, targets for folk who want to steal our identifying information and cause malfeasance.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think there's no question that, the losses have gone up. I mean, I love the IBM data breach report. They said that, last year the losses have doubled. Globally, it's I think 4.5, US 9.44. I can't imagine what the change healthcare $1 billion loss is going to do to that average number. It's going to go up 10x. I don't know what the total is, but there's no question about that. And I'm sure you remember too that when MGM first disclosed that their losses would be over 100 million. People are like, that's insane. How could it be so much? It's used to be ransomware demand in the tens and 20s, but Change Healthcare, it all that goes away. You have $1 billion loss. They just disclosed it, last week. 871 million total cost be over $1 billion. And that is bad news. This is bad news for everybody. Well, maybe bad news except everybody except MGM, because now by comparison, the $100 million won't seem so bad. But it's crazy. Yeah. And do you think it's affecting in the headlines we read about it only, big companies? Do you think those risks are increasing for smaller companies too? As I'm saying, is this a phenomenon you think, this increase of phenomenon just for large companies, or do you see this risk for all companies?
So, I mean, just like how there's small and large organizations, I'm confident that there are small and large attackers, right? I'm sure some folk would be very happy to attack something that doesn't clear multiple billions of revenue because perhaps to a small outfit, maybe tens of thousands of dollars of ransom for something like a ransomware attack would be enough to keep them sustained. So, it seems as though, like, I think everybody will be at risk, and especially those smaller organizations with limited operational budgets or organizations where perhaps IT security is not a seen as a strategic component of their business. And my concern there is that they're going to learn the hard way, regardless their size, regardless their industry, that they too are targets. And unfortunately, this is the new cost of doing business.
Yeah, that's a nice segue to our second topic. We actually started answering. That's, you and I agree that the increase is real. It's more attacks, bigger losses, big everything. That's clear. Yeah, and what's driving that? What's driving that increase? You've touched on that. It's across the board. And you see that. I also see, two interesting news stories in the last month. One was actually was a blog post by Trend Micro where they talked about Lab Rat, Lab Host, the service. You can subscribe to ransomware as a service, and they have three different tiers. One is 179 a month, one is 249 a month, one is 300. But there's these tools, and there was another story this week. It was by HelpNet Security. They're a great media source about what did they call it? Something guns, junk guns, about on the real low end of attacks that you can license some ransomware as a service for one-time use for as low as $20. They said the average was 300. But this is put, in the old days, it was, these groups that were attacking, they put a lot of effort into writing their code, and they realized that, hey, we can franchise. And we can get, and so there's so many more attack, but now you have people that have no skill, very limited skills that can now license this software. Do you think that changes the game from a security side, John?
Yeah, very similar to how, initially software was boutique, in-house, very specific for business use cases, and then eventually the businesses evolved to use, best in breed services, and then finally consolidated platforms for the most part. I could only imagine a similar trajectory would go in brand new frontiers of opportunities to make money in a criminal enterprise, and that suggests that some very enterprising organizations realize that, hey, we can pop big targets. That gets a lot of heat on us. Alternatively, what if we just facilitate the tools and then have a whole bunch of distributed folk be the attackers? There's something to be said about positioning oneself like that. It makes good business sense, but it is absolutely horrifying, like at the same time.
I remember that. I wrote the same thing. I have some of the same thoughts, and that everybody says we live in a gig economy now.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I imagine the same person who may be a personal shopper, getting my grocery in the morning and then drives me to the airport in Uber in the afternoon. At night, another gig. Use these tools that are on the dark net, and now they're launching attacks. I mean, not against Chase Bank. Good luck ever getting in there. They have the best security to the other big banks, but a lot of small, medium-sized business they could do that. And I think, tell me if you disagree that 10 years ago, even up to a couple years ago, a lot of small organizations felt we're safe just because they didn't abandon their responsibilities, but we're safe just because we're below the radar. Who would go to all that effort to attack us? I think that changes now. When you could buy these tools for $100, even if you only get $10,000 of ransom, somebody doing it as a gig once a month, getting $10,000, they just doubled their income. I think this really changes the game, as people say, but I think it really increases the risk, especially for small and medium-sized businesses. I mean, do you agree with that?
Oh yeah. So one of the first things, acolytes to security learn is, security through obscurity sounds cool, but No, it's not a durable fashion. It's literally luck. And if you do not want to rely on pure luck and just not being discovered, well, to your point, now that the cost and barrier to entry is so much lower, naturally that means all the targets, even if they're lower value, are now in scope. So I think it's just the nature of the beast and the commoditization of attacks, because now nobody's going to be safe.
For sure. I agree. When you look at it was CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, Department of Homeland
Mhm.
Security. We talked earlier about all these vendor numbers. I trust CISA's numbers. Because they see everything and they have no stake in misleading. Not that vendors do, but they're much more reliable numbers. They say 90% of ransomware attacks, successful ones, start with a phishing email, and they go on to defeat MFA. So if Gen AI is such a powerful tool, and people are now going to use it to do phishing emails, what does that mean for trying to train everybody in your team to identify phishing emails? What happens when they're all impossible to spot? You think Gen AI is going to bring about, I almost said Gen AE. Think Gen AI is going to bring about that kind of change, John?
So I would argue that to a certain extent it already has, maybe not even Gen AI, more like kind of the operationalization of these phishing attacks. So rather than focus on what's causing the volume of them, it'd be better to focus on how you can stop what happens. But before we get into that kind of component, I'd say um, something that I find, I'm going to say personally irksome in the field of security is always blaming your users. As somebody who has worked in security for 20 years and notwithstanding, I'm not perfect. And when I consider other folk who have depth of expertise in business processes that I don't, things like imagine technical program management or just general project management or financial forecasting, something like that, I would struggle to be an effective person to understand a baseline level of everything they need to understand. So, by extension, that informs me that I should not use employees as the first line of defense. Yes, do the training. Yes, get them a little bit more suspicious of, weird domains like, something dot something dot uk dot ro dot q. Like it's fine, but to just blame the users isn't going to save the organization from a loss of data. And instead, you need much more proactive and or prophylactive methods of authentication to help those folk who are so busy and focused on the actual value they provide to their business to not become information security experts.
I couldn't agree more. You have all these organizations who are trying to turn the finance expert into a spotting phishing email expert, and the HR expert, and the operations expert, and the sales expert. You all have now become experts in cybersecurity. No way. And what does that do to productivity? And all it takes is one. And when you look at all the major breaches, I shouldn't say all of them, 90% of them, but ones like Clorox, MGM, Johnson Controls, Schneider Electric. I mean, the list goes on and on. Uh, Almost every one of those, it was a user. You know, I love Uber, I use them all the time. They fell victim to a MFA bombing attack. They kept hitting, you know the story. They kept hitting the sysadmin with a request to approve. He finally approved it. I don't know the exact story, but this is how it's been told. Finally, late at night, he hit approve. They asked him, "Why'd you do that?" It was late. I wanted to go to bed. He had to sleep. But and maybe that's true or not. But it is users, so yes, it makes sense to blame them only to the extent that it's their fault. But we're asking way too much. I think that was your point. We're asking too much of them. And Gen AI, I think, is going to make that tougher. There's a really great blog post from, and you probably know her, Stephanie Carruthers, who runs the X-Force Red Team for IBM. I mean, they're world famous, their skills and so forth. She ran a blog post because she had the team take ChatGPT and take, the guardrails off. So essentially fraud GPT, which
Mhm.
you can find on the dark web. And she matched it against her best people. And I thought the blog post was fascinating because this was like back when, if you're a Jeopardy fan, you remember when Ken Jennings went up against IBM Watson and they crushed him. It's like, oh my goodness, my hero. But she did the same thing. But in this case, her people beat ChatGPT. Uh, but there was a big difference. And she didn't beat him by that much. And these were business executives they were targeting. I think she has 14% success rate, and ChatGPT had 11, which is still incredibly high.
Hmm.
On average, her team took 16 hours to create that phishing email. ChatGPT, just 5 minutes. And I asked an IBM exec at one of the conferences I was at, hey, how many people do you think have the skills of that red team? They're like, oh, 10 or 20,000 people on the entire planet. Like, how many people do you think could use a large language model to craft a really effective phishing email? They're like, maybe one or two, billion people. Essentially, anybody access access with the internet. So
Hmm.
you look at, you were talking earlier about the tools. I think that's going to be one of the most dangerous tools in the hands of amateur hackers when, I mean, everything rides on that. Can I get him to click or not? And when you've got the power of generative AI, wow, I think that's a, I don't want to sound dystopian, but I think that's a scary future.
I mean, it is, but then again, I mean, security has always made their headway in light of the new horrifying things in the future. And whether or not that's a positive or negative, right? Like we all need to react to uh, the reality of the situation on the ground there. And regarding Gen AI, and like I think you're hitting on something that is going to be impactful, and I think is probably the under stated impact of Gen AI across not just the negative use cases like you're identifying, but the positive ones too. Is that Gen AI is, you want to dismiss it as okay, it's just very, very fancy autocorrect or what have you. But the issue is, if something could be as effective as a very highly trained person and do it in a fraction of the time, and even if it is only, let's say, let's be very generous, 80% is effective, that is still a quantum leap in terms of attack vectors, in terms of credibility of attacks, in terms of susceptibility. It is nuts. So yeah, like poo poo Gen AI all you want. I know I'm in the kind of skeptics camp as a big Dune fan, and I'll leave the folk watching to figure that one out. But um, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if it's not as good as a person. What matters is that it can do it so much faster and so much more frequently. Mhm.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you mentioned Nazareth as a person. There's a big difference there, because there's ChatGPT 3 and now ChatGPT 4. It's going to keep getting better and better and better. And one of the things that, I mean, you've been in the cybersecurity space for a long time. We've both seen huge advancements in the technology used to defend. It just keeps getting better and better every year. There's one thing that hasn't improved in those 20 years by much. I mean, nobody forced it a lot to improve it, but it's people, it's humans, it's users. They haven't gotten that much better at doing these things in spite of the training. And then I saw another stat at the start of the year. It was from an HR group, and it said 25%, 40%. They said 40% of people plan to quit their job this year. So I thought, well, that's going to be much higher turnover. But also, you hear about quiet quitters and disengaged employees. But even if the number is only 20%, whatever number that is, I mean, do you think those people who are getting ready to quit are trying their absolute hardest to stop a cyber attack? And that's back to, I guess that's back to, user blaming, but it is asking a lot. And if these people are ready to leave, wow, that's asking a lot.
So I'd say that, like, yeah, on the one hand, it's very easy to say, okay, our disengaged or exiting employees don't have the same skin in the game because they're no longer worried about their career there. But that said, I would kind of, you know, that is what it is. And at the risk of using, stupid corporate speak to kind of dismiss it, I will say, as security professionals, that means we must be able to address it and ideally make sure that our solutions operate in such a way that that is not a concern. So I would interpret that instead much more of as a like requirement. Kind of like when you do product management or ownership, you entertain how your service or product is being consumed by your constituencies, be they the business, be they external customers, what have you. All right. So as a security and ideally an identity security practitioner, well, all right, consider your constituencies, all the personas, up to and including the disengaged person walking out the door. How can you implement then some sort of authentication or phishing prevention that will then make sure that is simply not a concern? Like, I'm not going to fault anybody for looking forward to their next gig if they're already walking off, right? Whomst amongst us have never been there, but at the same time, Cool. Like you can't blame the people. You can't always guarantee that people are going to be in your team, even if they are not malicious insiders. So a good technical control is going to be much more valuable than any amount of training.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it also has to do a little bit with tools. We advocate next generation MFA for a couple of reasons. One, because all these successful attacks, they defeated the MFA. But it's also, I mean, it's 20 legacy MFA, most of it's 20-year-old technology. I mean, you think about, trying to stop these devastating attacks that are very sophisticated, with 20-year-old technology, like sending an OTP over an SMS, or a shared secret, where it's not asynchronous and it's failing. And I think, when I talk to a large group, I'll often ask the audience, hey, how many of you woke up this morning and used dial-up to connect to your corporate resources? How many of you are going to send a fax today? How many of you have a floppy disk with you? How many of you know what one is? But those are all examples of 20-year-old technology. But the MFA we're using as part of our, securing access, most of it's, 20-year-old technology. And there's a lot of companies out there, a lot of new companies out there now that are, offering phishing resistant MFA and next generation MFA. And I don't want to turn this into a product pitch at all, but that's a big part of our message of whoever's solution. It's ones that, don't blame the user, but don't count on that user to be your primary defense against attackers. Make it so that you don't have to rely on them. Make them so they don't have to be experts, and use modern technology. And there's this,
So I
yeah,
feel like you're begging a question here in terms of okay, what do you consider modern MFA? And like it's been kind of a almost mimetic inside of the identity security field about how okay, no, SMS has been compromised for a long time now. It is not
yeah,
worth it at all. And now I'm starting to see the march towards I'm sorry, phishable MFA is not worth it, right? So those strike me as the 20-year-old technologies. And putting my identity practitioner hat, not necessarily as somebody who is affiliated with a vendor here, I'm going to say that if yeah, that stuff is garbage, but let's consider the use case.
yeah,
Like in a world of consumers, that is so much better. Workforce, not at all adequate. And
yeah,
things like what I'm going to assume are some of the more modern MFA standards that you're hinting at would be things like WebAuthn based on FIDO2. And
right.
then now we're seeing penetration in the customer space to care of passkeys on major platform providers. And similar story in the enterprise has been like one of the big things that I worked on last year was positioning my organization to use fully phishing resistant authentication, and the mechanisms to do that are now standards based. There's proprietary ways to do it as well, but I would encourage, be it standards based, be it proprietary, let's kind of elevate our thinking in terms of what the enterprise should do, because even at the customer level, the customer identity level, we're now getting to a place where it's very easy to use single credential phishing resistant authentication for everything.
Yeah. And that's the direction we tell people they should go with the, you know, biometric base,
Mhm.
asymmetric, phishing resistant. And most of the current MFA implementations, it probably wouldn't meet that description. Not that people are making bad decisions, but I think it's important. The part of this session is really to challenge the way, maybe not challenge, just say introduce new ways of thinking about this. I think for most organizations, they've kind of like, we're set. We've got MFA. We're safe, right? It's like, well, not all MFA is created equal. And, it's if bad people are breaking your locks, get better locks. I think is is what we suggest. But so we touched on the last subject I had. I want to talk about. You have this way of answering my questions before I ask them, so you're very good at that. But that is, what else? What else do you think that security practitioners can do, other than fixing their MFA to lower their risk and improve their network security? I'll add one comment. There was and you saw it too, as a news story, record leak of, there's 26 billion records out there. Well, it wasn't one, loss. It was the accumulation. When you look at 26 billion sets of credentials out there, well, I think that's more people than people on the planet times 4 or 5. So obviously credentials are out there. There's constant attack, there's new tools. what else do you think security practitioners should be doing to improve their security posture?
So this is where I think defense in depth really kind of helps. And I know that's like not even a hip phrase to say anymore, but let's consider what zero trust is based on NIST. In theory, if you authenticate the user using strong authentication, and now that we have readily available phishing resistant authentication that is available, you understand and ideally authenticate the device as well. At the very least, get some sort of telemetry and signals. So you do the device authentication. And then also you evaluate the context through which the user and the device are authenticated and accessing a given resource. Is there something outside of the usual baseline pattern that would merit additional scrutiny? And as long as you have some sort of governance capability wrapped around that in your organization, congratulations, you've officially accomplished NIST zero trust architecture. Now, I realize saying that out loud, lots of people are really going to bring their pitchforks and saying, well, actually, and I don't blame you, but at the super high level, you authenticate the user, the device, review the context, and constantly review your security policies. And now you're in a nice zero trust type architecture upon which you could enrich and iterate upon to give all of the diverse ways to secure the organization, like all the really fun stuff that we can't even fathom yet. Like, I'm not going to answer your next question before you ask it, but yeah.
It that's one of the benefits of AI. I mean, we're one of both of us are one of 3,000 vendors in the cybersecurity space, and I think 2,999 of them are claiming they use AI to improve security. We don't. We say we protect you against evil people using AI. But
Mhm.
when you look at that, and I think what's really going to change is the ability to identify anomalous behavior in real time. I think that's something that as an industry we've been chasing. And in the old days, you'd see somebody they announced in November a breach that actually happened in April and they discovered in October. We are moving to real-time detection of anomalous behavior. And but that raises the question of, what next? I give an example of, okay, the CFO is in Italy on holiday with her significant other. She borrows her laptop and tries to transfer funds for payroll. Okay, wrong device, wrong IP, wrong geo, wrong time. And she's usually does things before she tries to transfer funds. Everything about that is wrong. So you've identified it. What do? Shut it down? Now she can't do it, and you don't make payroll, or have her re-authenticate with whatever legacy interface she just used and was defeated. Okay, you slow down the attack by 10 minutes. So that's where I think the phishing resistant next gen MFA will become critical in, after identifying that anomalous behavior, being able to say, because some of it's real. You can't
Yep.
just shut off everything that looks funny.
I
Um,
would travel from the East Coast over to San Francisco an awful lot, and we would use user behavioral detections to not block unusual things, but rather raise the friction. So when I first signed into the office in San Francisco, well, I had to use a phishing resistant authenticator before we made those our only authenticators, primarily because, well, something's weird about John compared to where he usually is in Richmond, Virginia. Thus, let's make sure we have a nice high assurance authenticator before we allow him to continue what it is. So that's the kind of cool stuff one can accomplish with either AI or behavioral based policies using that pattern matching.
all right, we're coming near the end of our time. Any last thoughts or closing comments you want to share with our audience?
So whereas we are looking towards the future of the next generation of authentication, which is here today, I think things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, using those things for identity threat protection and then merging with additional standards, something like the shared signals framework from the OpenID Foundation. I think that's going to be the 1-2 punch that's really going to help harden organizations. And so if I had a call to action, which I wasn't asked to have, it'd be please support those standards, participate in those standards, not necessarily from a standards body perspective, but be a consumer of them. Because by so doing, something like a shared security framework where if one relying party or an identity provider senses a change in the context or something abnormal about a user, they're able to then send those signals elsewhere and not necessarily lock them out, but force that higher level of authentication. The fact that we have the technology now to do that across multiple domains, multiple different providers, if you subscribe to that same framework, is very powerful from securing not just individuals, but also organizations. So really, standards are there for a reason. They certainly help. And we have all sorts of fun stuff that's going to be eventually essential, much like how single sign on is essential these days in the enterprise, to making sure you don't get gobbled alive by generative AI.
Those are good thoughts. And I agree wholeheartedly with supporting standards. I mean, think our organization I was with 10 years ago. We were on the joined the FIDO board and working groups, and we thought, wow, this is so great, so important. It's just gonna sweep the industry. You
Mhm.
know, 5 years later, still waiting for adoption. Fortunately, FIDO 2 is so compelling and with passkeys, where I think we're finally starting to see some real traction, some real inroads where it's not why are you using it, but it's how could you possibly not, be supporting. And there's other standards out there too. I think, if my closing thoughts would be our space is just so phenomenally complex. I mentioned 3,000 vendors, and you look at the security stack that so many organizations have, and it's dozens of providers, and making it all work and supporting it is so trick. And I think it just starts with prioritizing what's the biggest risk, and how do we prioritize that? How are people getting in today? But, if we succeed at making users not be the weak link, and they can't get in the way they are now, stolen credentials and defeating MFA. Okay, RDP attacks go up higher. Saw a post last week about a group at University of Chicago, Urbana-Champaign. They use generative AI to look at new VCs that are announced and go attack them. And they have like an 80% success rate. So it's just the world is changing. So we solve one, it's like whack-a-mole. We solve one problem, but I think we have to chase that. We have to solve the biggest problems first. So let me wrap up by thanking you so much for joining me for this. Really enjoyed our conversation. We very much enjoy your solution. We are a customer of yours. Yeah, and that's not why I came on this session, but yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for your insights. I hope that everybody listening to this session, you got a lot of value out of it. You can contact either of us on LinkedIn if you have any follow-up questions. I think there's a place you can ask questions, but if you don't want to ask them in a group, and I hope I'm speaking for you, John, to say people feel free to reach out to us. Uh,
I'm one of those weirdos who's memorized my own LinkedIn address so I could share it with customers and other practitioners I talk to. So I'm all about building a community, sharing best practices. We all get better when we bump off of each other and sharpen our mutual flints.
Right on. Well, the cybersecurity space needs more weirdos, as you call yourself, like you, to help win this fight against, the enemy nations that we're really fighting. And it's let me sound patriotic for a minute, but it's not just a commerce. And it's, this is Russia and North Korea and Iran and China that are attacking our organizations. And so it's a fight, it's a fight we have to win. Thank you
Agreed.
again very much. And thank you everybody for listening to the session.
Yep. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.